Well, welcome everybody to today's College Sports Communicators Teachable Tuesday live webinar. We're pleased to offer this session on working with volleyball statistics and stat rules. Thanks for joining this important session as we discuss ways to assist CSC members in all areas of preparing to be a game day volleyball statistician, and in helping you understand the game rules and statistical rules you will need to follow. Our presenters are leading volleyball statisticians with extensive experience, and they are here to offer their thoughts and expertise and take your questions. And we welcome your questions at any time. Just place them in the questions chat function of this Zoom. A reminder, this is not a how-to training session on using stat software like NCAA Live Stats or Presto Sports. I'm Mark Albanese, the Director of Sports Communication at Pacific Lutheran University and a member of the CSC Professional Development and Education Committee. I will serve as the webinar moderator. As a reminder, we're recording this webinar, and later on the CSC website and YouTube page, you can watch it as an on-demand session. Please invite fellow current CSC colleagues to listen and watch this too. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. We have four great panelists today, and they've combined to stat hundreds, if not thousands, of volleyball matches in their careers, representing all three NCAA divisions. Our first panelist is Mindy Brower, the Assistant Director of Communications, Promotions, and Marketing at Division III MIT. Mindy is the primary contact for the Engineers volleyball team and is in year 21 at MIT. Our next panelist is CSC Hall of Famer and CSC Professional Development and Education Committee member, Diane Nordstrom. Diane is the Associate Director for Brand Communication for the 2021 NCAA champion Wisconsin Badgers. Our next panelist is Joe Reinsch, the Assistant Commissioner from the Division II Pacific West Conference and current volleyball statistician for USC, Long Beach State, UCLA, and at the 2022 Men's NCAA Championships. And our final panelist is Shane White. Shane is the official statistician for USA Volleyball since 2018, a high school volleyball official in Ohio for the last 17 seasons, and a national line judge for the Professional Association of Volleyball Officials since 2017. Today's webinar will run through best practices pre-match, in-match, and post-match, along with some tricky plays and how they should be scored. We have some pre-generated questions, but we encourage everybody to ask questions in the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer them as time permits. So without further ado, let's get started, and I'll shoot it over to Diane to start. Talk a little bit about pre-match, kind of what is the best practices to get ready for that volleyball match.
Yeah, Joe and I are going to talk about how we set up matches. At Wisconsin, we actually have 3 people, and we sit courtside on the scorers table. We try to sit as far away from the 10-foot line of that, or farther out, just so our caller can have a better view of the court. We do have 1 caller, not 2, 1 caller, 1 inputter, and we also run a backup computer in case we run into issues. So, Joe, I don't know how, for you guys, how you set up at other levels?
Yeah, usually, in my experience working at Division II schools, it's usually 1 inputter and 1 caller. I have similar setups at the current spots I do. There's one adjustment at one of the at USC. They use I'll call it an auditor or a backup caller. So that's an extra set of eyes they tend to be watching, and we'll touch on replay later on, but they're actually set up with another monitor that shows the broadcast. So if there is a tricky play, something like that, that's just that extra set of eyes that's focused on the replay, while the primary caller and inputter stay focused on the live action.
A couple of things that we talked about just to help you out is, 1, make sure you introduce yourself to the down ref. That will help, and make sure that they can let you know, especially things like blocking errors. What number player was that had the blocking error? That is always something that's very good, that they just show you the number as well. And as Joe talked about, know what options you have for replay. If your match is being streamed, can you go back and watch a play if you have a question on something? Other things we talked about is make sure you test your printer. The last thing you want is to go to print and there's nothing there for your coaches. And the other thing is, if you have a home tournament, and you have two teams, two visiting teams, make sure you get that game code from the opposing school, or request just that personnel access through the NLS.
Diane, real quick question for you. How often have you had to use your backup stats input person just over the course of your career?
It depends upon if our primary person misses a play, then we'll go back. Something else is also handy to have is just have a piece of paper right next to you, and then you can write down and say, okay, at this score or this line, this is where we had an issue and we need to go back and correct that. And that's, again, I can either use my backup person or we can go back and refer to the video.
That's great. Shane, at this time, I'll kind of push it over to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the caller should be doing and kind of what their duties are and kind of how to teach that person what they're looking for?
Sure. So we know that we get our callers from all different aspects and avenues. Sometimes they're student callers, sometimes they are part-time folks that we bring in specifically for doing these types of jobs. But it's always important that you kind of set the expectation for what you need from your caller when you're doing live stats for volleyball. And importantly, probably the most important thing that we all agreed on when we were talking about this is they need to not stop talking, never stop. So even if there are trouble seeing a number or can't see around a pole or something, come up with what your game plan is going to be prior to the match for what you're going to do when you can't see that number. So either it's calling out another number that you may have somewhere on the roster. It may be just calling out a number that you see and knowing that you have to go back and fix that later, but just make sure that the caller knows not to stop talking, because once they stop, it's incredibly difficult to get them going again and get back into the cadence and the rhythm of the flow of the match. As far as training callers and how you might be able to do that, of course, we all rely heavily on video to help with that. So using some of the training videos that are out there, particularly if you're using NLS on the NLS site, that will allow you to listen to a match and listen to the calling and kind of see how that goes. Another way that you can do it too is if you're looking for a little more live action as opposed to just doing it off of a video. High school seasons usually start way before the college seasons do in the end of August. So sometimes the high school seasons will start late July to early August. So partner up with some of your local high schools, try to get into those matches early and see if they'll allow you to do some stat work for them. And that can be a good training ground for your callers and for your inputters as well. And that'll give them an opportunity to kind of see live action. Another good thing to keep in mind is that if you've got people who have experience with volleyball as a player, as a coach, they may have an idea of what stats mean and what certain stat terms mean. Be sure that you have the conversation with them about what official stat terms mean, because sometimes the bench stats that are kept for coaches or for players might not be the same categories that we're using on our side. They may call digs something different than what we statistically call them. And same thing for blocks. So we want to make sure that we're all kind of singing from the same songbook as far as that goes. And be sure you have a pen and paper handy next to the computer. Anytime you're doing this, whoever is doing it, calling, inputting, whatever, always have pen and paper there ready to write in case you need to take a note on something. And then before the first serve of the match, kind of take a look at the positioning of the receiving team and see where your primary passers are and figure out, from one side to the other, what those numbers are. So the first time you're looking for that number isn't when you see the ball going to them.
Awesome. That's great. And then just a little bit of clarification for everybody. If you have questions, put it in the Q&A, and then the chat, we'll keep it as a rolling chat function. But then a couple questions here for everybody, because I know people do it differently. Do you do full subs? Do you not do full subs? And if so, does that include tracking the libero subbing in and out? So
I prefer using full subs, but I also don't. I recommend using it if you're comfortable with the substitution patterns and if your caller is comfortable calling it. When I'm inputting, I'm usually, as soon as a point ends, I make it a point to kind of look at both benches, see if any subs are coming in. But where it's important to use full subs is if you do have something like stat boards, hustle boards that show live stats, it'll usually read the XML. The full subs will allow you to show the 6 players who are on the court at any given time, no matter who they are. And I know the other part of the question was including the libero. Yes, if you are using full subs, it wants to know when the libero is in and when the libero is out.
And that's also going to prevent any flags from showing up. So if you do use full subs, you're going to prevent any flags from showing up in the NLS. And also, it would also help for if there's any issues with the official scorekeeper, they can go back and refer to your play-by-play for any score corrections.
Does anybody have any additional benefits of using full subs outside of if you have a stat display?
I think for me, the other advantage, the reason I like using it, again, if the caller is comfortable with it and you feel confident, you can keep up with it. But what I like is if there is a very fast moving rally, and a number is difficult to see, instead of having to search through, if you're late in a set and there's been 4 subs already, instead of trying to identify one of these 10 players who's active on the screen, you only have the 6 players eligible on the screen. And ideally you have hit the setter enough times that you know who the setter is. Process of elimination, you can eliminate that one. It's a little bit easier to just identify based on who's on the court. You can, to me, I can do rallies a little bit quicker. It's easier to find the numbers because they're all in the same position on the court. But that's, like I said, it does need to be something that you're comfortable with, because if you fall behind and try to assign something, you'll have to fix the subs in the rotation in order to finalize a match.
That's awesome. And then we also had another question about over balls, and do you count those as digs? So I'll let you answer that one. So basically the question is, if there's an over ball, is that next hit? Is that being tracked? Is that a dig? Kind of talk a little bit about that and what that is statistically.
So no, that one would not be a dig. Anything on an over, the action would just start with the set after that. The same thing.
And for a lot of people using Genius, there is not even an option for the dig, which is kind of nice. But some of the legacy programs does not have that. So thanks for clarification on that. Mindy, I'm going to turn it to you. Can you kind of talk about SID needs and kind of what the expectation is of the things you need to be successful, whether it's a home match or an away match?
Sure. And actually, just one thing to add to some of the previous conversation we had about like developing or cultivating your group of statisticians. One thing that I've learned at MIT is asking if anyone who's working with you is colorblind, because that could definitely have an impact if you're using NLS, how you operate it as either an inputter or a caller. So this situation materialized 15 years ago, so it was not relevant to this topic, but a workaround could be just, asking if, if anyone can differentiate, but also just do like left or right for that piece. But moving on to just the needs that, for your athletic communications colleagues, since we're all using a variety of platforms at this point in time, a best practice would be to send either like the stat crew or the VRO roster, since you don't know what people are using. If the host school doesn't reach out to you and you're being proactive and saying, here's my stuff for the week. So feel free to, do that. And then on your word roster, if there's a difference in jersey number for that match, just please indicate that. And, once again, just checking that your roster is updated in the NCAA website, and kind of while you're hanging out in there, just checking that your schedule is, up to date with locations and times. And one thing too is, as you're, developing your, the match or whatever in game, whether it's NLS or Presto or, stat crew, just indicate inactive players, or try to find out inactive players. So that way you don't inadvertently give credit for participation or any stats go their way.
Great. And then, we have another question coming in here, and it pertains to when there's people who go in the net. How do you penalize the person that is in the net, and what do you type in statistically to make that the right call? And this person kind of mentions that Division III, they sometimes have that 2 to 3 times a match. and just wondering how that looks statistically.
I guess it depends upon when that person is in the net. If it's on a block, it's obviously a blocking error. If it's on an attack, it's going to be a hitting error. So it may be a little more clarification on when that player is in the net. But if it's something that's inadvertent, then you kind of have to make that call. And again, maybe we can get into that maybe when we get down to the tough plays when you're looking for something to call.
Yeah, and there's some clarification on that. Most time it was on kills that there would be the net call.
So that would be an attack error. So
awesome. Thanks for that. And then kind of going back to the basics, and Joe, I'm going to push this to you. You know, kind of what do you do between sets? Kind of what does that look like? Kind of talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So what I like to do between sets, once I've wrapped up the previous set, you kind of have that long break there. But what I typically do, a lot of teams will not change starters from set to set. They might change rotations, but I'll just put in the original starters. It makes it a little bit easier to, again, if a number is difficult to see when they're in that huddle prior to the set, you can, again, process of elimination, kind of get down to the one or two players that are missing. That's just what I do. But yeah, really pay attention to who's out there on the court, because once they're ready to go, they're not waiting for the statisticians. So you need to be ready to make sure that you've got your starters in the set, because we cannot record statistics without having the correct starters in. Kind of moving on, just a general theme is, I think Shane mentioned it earlier, but just keeping up with something. You're either going to miss a number, you're going to miss a rally, things are moving too quickly. Yes, we're all human. We'll all miss something. But the best thing to do is just keep going. Anytime I'm working with any kind of a new caller, just a reminder that I like to give them is I don't want to spend a lot of time identifying one player to get that stat 100% accurate, because then you're probably going to miss the next 4, 5, 6 touches trying to get the one accurate. I'd rather just move on, you can put either any number, skip the set, whatever it is, and then keep the rest of the stats current. You can't, it's a lot easier to fix something that you know is incorrect than it is to try to find things that you didn't see because you were going back to look for the one thing that was missed. And you can always write it down, even as a mental note as an inputter. I'll say, okay, that second set, that wasn't the setter. Mentally, I note that so that as soon as the point is over, I can just go right back to that particular touch, change it to the right number, because I'll put in the wrong number sometimes. I think we've already talked about whether or not to call digs after an over or a continue. So I think we're good there. That is not a dig. You just move straight on to the set. One of the things our group talked about was what constitutes an over versus an attack. And so it's really, I want to say this is the beauty of official stats. There are certain things in the stats manual, you go for the definition and it says, here's the definition, and it's in the judgment of the scorer. So for whether something is an attack or an over, it really has to do with intent. Are they placing it in a position that's making the defense adjust, or if they're trying to put it to where the setter has to play it to get the other team out of their system. It has more to do with intent and how much effort the receiving team has to do to get the ball. And then sometimes you will have an over that turns into a point, and then you'll have to just make that an attack and a kill if that's the case. One more note on blocking, crediting both people who go up for a block or 3 people if all 3 go up for a block. The blockers don't have any control over where the hitter is going to hit the ball. So no matter whose arm it goes off of, if 2 people are up for a block or 3 people are up for a block, they are considered a unit. They're considered a block, and they would all get credit for that because they put up an effective block that resulted in a point for them. And I'll just keep going, Mark, unless you interrupt me. Yeah, an overpass. Let's say a serve receive, someone passes it, it goes right back over the net, and they attack it. That would be a kill and not a block because there was no attack. The person on the other side of the net is directing the ball, so that would be a kill and not a block. Challenge plays, if there's a replay that the officials go and they replay the previous play, all of those stats would be, replay. That entire point is deleted as though it never happened. It's just done over from the start. Or if they're reviewing either in or out, or whether there was a touch or not, that will just change the point. The only tricky thing on live stats is if you do change an attack error to a kill on a replay, it only changes that final action. It doesn't change the set attempt to an assist, so you will have to manually change that to a set assist. And then I think we've already touched on the benefits, or the pros and cons of using full subs. And I prefer it, but I definitely, if I'm not completely comfortable with it, if I'm working with a new caller who doesn't feel comfortable with it, I'll turn it off, and we'll just go that way as well.
You know, Joe, and maybe anybody can answer this too. Do you do any stat changes during timeouts, or do you wait till the end of the set to do it?
To me, it depends on how complicated it is. I typically, if it's something if it's one or two touches that need to be changed, I can do those during timeouts. If I missed 3 or 4 touches in a rally and we've got to rewatch it, I'll usually hold that until between sets and make sure that, again, it's whatever you feel comfortable doing that allows you to stay current, I think is the most important part of that.
Great. And then, you know, this panelist, it's a cross section. Some people are callers, some people are inputters. What advice would you give to somebody who it's their first match inputting? What is that advice you give them to get to that day and what they need to remember while they're statting that first game? Because, you know, volleyball comes at you pretty fast.
I would say any practice. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
No, I was going to say, I thought Shane kind of mentioned something along those lines earlier, but get as much practice as you can, whether that's watching videos. He mentioned even doing whatever you can to get adjusted to the speed of the live action, I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, I would agree. The more you can get that computer, lots of times we'll use our second backup computer as a training tool. So if you do have an option of bringing in a second computer and having somebody train as an inputter, you know, that gives you another person who you can use all season.
I think another thing is knowing how to fix mistakes, because I feel like that's a big stressor or anxiety producing situation. So knowing how to fix things, or knowing that you have someone with you who knows how to fix things, like your caller or someone else. I think that will help take some of the edge off as well.
Yeah, and you know, another thing too, if you're by a nearby college, you can always pop over if you have a non-conference game before your first home match, and kind of do a dummy game ahead of time. You know, we have a tournament across town at UPS, so we'll go there at the start of the year to get ourselves ready to go for our matches. You know, there's been a lot of questions about a bad set versus ball handling error. So can kind of talk about some of those nuanced plays that are sometimes trickier when you're statting.
Yeah, I can kind of start that one off. So in regards to the stat definition, a ball handling error, BHE, if you're using NLS, is only something that is called by the official. So that is either a double contact or an illegal contact. So if it's a double contact or an illegal contact, then those are the times when you would use BHE. And if it's an double contact, it's usually on the second contact. So that's when you would use BHE. A setting error, on the other hand, is basically what we refer to as a bad set that is not hittable by the attacker, and the set, you know, doesn't allow for any kind of offensive effort to be put toward scoring a point.
Yeah, I would agree that in that case, you need to decide, is it the setter that had the error, or was it the hitter, that the hitter made a poor approach? In most cases, I would lean towards the positive by giving it to the setter in error, because then it doesn't affect your hitter's statistics, because, you know, in most cases, error towards the positive.
And just as a follow-up with the ball handling error, that's called by the official. So they'll blow the whistle and stop play. So that is kind of your cue for this is a ball handling error situation, not a bad set. Kind of what, you know, Diana was referring to, where there's a set to nowhere, or the attacker is trying to salvage a situation when they weren't put in a successful position. So kind of other ways to visualize the situations as well.
That's great. And Mindy, I'm going to keep it with you. Can you explain to someone who is learning how to stat call, kind of what an over and continue is? Like, how is the best way to explain those two situations?
Sure. So with an over, it's just the ball is moved to the other side of the net. So that's one thing where, regardless of which stat platform I'm using, I'll say over. With NLS, there's no actual action. You just move the mouse. Continue, there's the attack, and the action continues on the same side of the net. So that's just a way. And once again, with NLS, there's nothing to enter, but it's just a way the over ball goes over. It switches sides to continue. It continues on the same side. And when things get wacky, where you have continue over, I just start, it's kind of what we were talking about when the rallies get a little out of hand sometimes. Just say, we're going to start like set on the left side, just to kind of provide some stability to that situation.
And over is considered just the ball. There's somebody's trying to keep the ball in play and send it over the net. They're not trying to attack the ball. They're just trying to keep it in play. Continue is usually going to happen off a block by the opposing team, where it continues, like Mindy said, continues on the same side of the court.
Great, great. And then kind of let's dive into some of these trickier plays, the tough plays. We kind of already mentioned trying to give the positive stats versus the negatives, but maybe talk about, you know, back row setting, you know, hitting error for a setter if they attack, kind of some of those nuanced plays.
Sure. Yeah. If you're have a school or you know, opposing school, whatever, who's running an offense that uses a back row setter at times, you'll want to become familiar with two main officiating signals. The first one is this one, which is a back row block. And then the other one, which is an illegal attack, which is just kind of the hand down like that. What's important about those is they are two different kinds of errors if they occur with your setter. So if you see the illegal attack, then it's going to be an attack error on the setter if she's back row and sends the ball over in the front zone. If you see the back row block signal, then that's going to be a blocking error on the setter. And the attack and kill will go to the player who hit the ball into her on the other side.
Great. And then, you know, if there's a 50-50 ball, there's both sides are going up at the net. How do you typically score that? You know, is it a kill? Is it a block? How do you kind of decide what that play is?
I consider that a kill for whoever wins that joust. So basically both players from the opposing teams, they're both trying to score, and, you know, whoever wins that joust wins the point. So that's typically kill. In a lot of cases, you're going to see your setters doing that, and the setter, since they're kind of used to that and they have those strong hands, they are probably going to win that joust. So yes, that would be a kill.
Great, great. And then, you know, if somebody's out of rotation, how is that getting inputted in your stat program when that happens?
So out of rotations are called on serve. So it's either the serving team or the receiving team that's out of rotation. If it's just a rotation error, meaning that there's an overlap somewhere, either on the serving or receiving team, then if it's on the serving team, then it goes as a service error. If it's on the receiving team, it goes as an ace, and the reception error goes to the team. So those difference. If it's an improper server, so it is the wrong server, technically the serve is the service error, but the service error should go to the person who is supposed to be serving. So you may not know that in the moment. You probably aren't going to know that in the moment. So that may be one where if you know that they're calling them out of rotation because the server, it was an illegal server, you might want to circle that one and write that down and find out later from the official score who the actual server was supposed to be, because technically they're the ones who are supposed to get that error.
Awesome. And then Shane, would you mind going over some common volleyball signals so people just kind of have the awareness of what they are?
Sure. So we did the illegal attack and the illegal back row block. Some of the others that you'll commonly see, if you see the two, that is the double contact. So when you use your ball handling error key in that regard. And then if you see kind of a lifting motion there, that's for the illegal contact, which can also be a ball handling error. We've seen the attack and the, other than that, you know, touch and out are pretty common. Of course, the standard in call. For a net violation, what is supposed to happen is the second referee is supposed to initiate that. They're supposed to point at the net, then give you the number, and then award the point. And then the first referee will repeat that number. So if you miss the second referee giving you the number to begin with, the first referee should repeat that number for you so that you'll have a second opportunity to see who the blocking error was on, who the net call was on. And if you do have a rotation error, it's going to be like this, is what you're going to see. So don't see those a lot in the college game, but occasionally they do happen, and they'll usually happen at the most inopportune time. So just be sure that you're aware and ready for that. And I think that's the majority of what you would typically see. Oh, if you do see a 4 hits, that means that there was no touch on the block, so the ball was contacted 4 times on one side. That's a good indicator for you. Sometimes if you see a ball kind of go into the tape and then is played again and the officials stop play and call 4, sometimes folks will think that was a block because they'll think that the ball, you know, got blocked down. But if they're calling 4 hits, then it is solely an attacking error and there was no block on the play. They're saying that the block did not touch the ball.
Great. And then some questions coming in about on serving and whether it's a service ace. What's your discretion of like who receives the reception error? When do you give it to an individual? When do you give it to a team? Kind of talk about how you deal with that.
So the rule states that the second ball, if the second ball is unplayable, then it's a service ace. So basically, if the receive shanks the ball into the thing, that's an easy call. Or if the ball lands on the opposite side of the court, that's an easy one. But if the second ball is unplayable, then it's an ace. So in most cases, it's obvious that player goes to whoever shanked the ball. Sometimes maybe the ball lands between 2 players on the court, and then it's up to you as the statistician. You can give it to one of those 2 players, or you can give it a team, since maybe you didn't know who was supposed to receive that ball. So it's kind of up to the discretion to your caller who receives that reception error.
And one of the things we talked about the other day too is that, you know, if the ball hits the tape and kind of trickles over, 99 times out of 100, I'm going to give that as a team reception error, because there's no player that would be able to make that play. You'll occasionally get a player who will try to make a play on that, or who may be successful in making a play, but it's one of those situations where we want to try to give the positive versus the negative. Don't want to penalize someone with a reception error when really there was nothing they could do about the ball hitting the top of the tape before it went over.
Great. And then, you know, statting games, has anybody ever had a situation where a coach is blocking their view of statting the game? And how do you go about handling that situation when that arises?
Yeah, I just try to work around them. So if it's it's either leaning, it's even moving. You know, if the collar's got to move just a little bit to see around them. I tend not to interrupt the coaches while they're coaching the match. I know it's less than ideal. There's some places that you just can't avoid it. It's going to happen. But do your best to work around it. I think one thing, and then this kind of goes back to even pre-match, but just something that I'll try to do in communicating with the caller is, a lot of times I'll say, well, I can see the serve receive here. I'll get the pass maybe, especially if there's a coach in the way. Just communicating, okay, I've got a good angle on this portion of the net, and I'll keep an eye on that and help out a little bit. So I think there's it maybe forces you to communicate between caller and inputter a little more. But yeah, I typically will not ask coaches to move because they have the right to be there. It's not ideal for us as statisticians, but for me, I've got to just do the best we can to work around that.
I know one of the people on our call when we discuss this with, and we do this too at Wisconsin, is we have to use headphones. So, we can't hear over our crowd. So our stats people are on headsets, and that makes it much easier for them to either, like Joe said, to communicate with each other and say, oh yeah, I saw that, versus maybe the caller didn't.
And well, I have the luxury of not having any spectators behind our scores table. So we just, as a caller, I stand, or anyone who is calling, they tend to stand just for, even if the down ref's in the way, kind of thing. So if you have the ability to do so in those situations, because it happens with me in basketball, the referee's in my line of sight. So I might pop up every once in a while. But yeah, depending on your setup, if you need to stand, you might need to do that as well.
Great. That's awesome. Another question, kind of a specific scenario. When there's there's an overball that lands for a kill, would you ever credit an assist on that? Perfect. Kind of moving on. Shane, can you kind of touch on the differences between men's and women's volleyball? I think most people, they have women's volleyball, but some people around the country also have the men's, and there are some differences to the two.
Yeah, and to that point too, I saw a couple other questions in the Q&A about the number system that we use on the women's side. So I'll explain that as I explain some of the differences here between men and women. So there are basically two big differences if you're statting, or three big differences between if you're statting men's matches versus women's matches. One of the big ones is that on the men's side, they can use two liberos. So you may have the ability to put two liberos into your stat system. Those liberos can exchange throughout the entire match. So one libero may start, the next rally, the other libero may come in the same position for that libero. So there's a lot of movement sometimes on the men's side, and sometimes they'll use those one libero they'll use for serve receive, and then when they're serving, they'll put the other libero in for other defensive purposes. Another big difference between the men's and the women's game as far as officiating is concerned is that on the men's side, when there is a net violation, they do not give numbers. So they actually point at the net and then point at the player who was the offender in the net. So it'll be a point at the net and then a point out to whatever player was in the net. If you talk with your second referee ahead of time, as we were discussing earlier, you can sometimes get them to signal back to you discreetly what that number is, because it may not always be clear. Sometimes it's very clear and you can tell exactly who's in the net, but sometimes it may not be. And so if you ask them at the beginning of the match if they could kind of give you the number on the side, most of them will be willing to do that for you, to kind of show you that it was 23 that was in the net, or whoever. And then the other big difference is, and this is part of why we point instead of using numbers for the men, we use USA Volleyball mechanics and FIVB mechanics as opposed to the NCAA mechanics. So for an illegal attack, where we said for women's it's this, on the men's side it's going to be this, where it comes in front of your face, comes up and down in front of your face. So that would be an illegal attack on the men's side. So the question about numbers, I'll give you briefly. So we're taught to fill up our right hands first and then go to our left hand when we're doing numbers. So if I'm doing 7, I'm going to do it this way, so that when you're reading it, hopefully you're seeing 5, then 2, and that becomes 7. When we're doing a number that has a 10 in it, it's going to be, this is 10 and 2, so that makes 12. Okay, so same thing, if it's number 15, it's going to be the fist and 5 for 15. Just a fist by itself is 10, that'll be 0. And then the one number that is different from everything is 3. So 3 is actually like this. And that there's a very long story about that I'm not sure I buy, but 3 is that's the number for 3. So if you were doing 13, it would be 13 like that.
Awesome. And then, a question for everybody when you're statting, do you use a laptop and a mouse? Or are you using a touch screen? Kind of what is your preference when doing volleyball?
We actually have touch screens, but we also put a mouse with the touch screen. So it kind of depends upon your inputter, what they prefer. Some find it easier just to do the touch screen, but others are still kind of like, no, I like to use the mouse. So I guess it'd be a question of who your inputter is and what they would prefer.
Great. And then we talked a little bit about some of this earlier, but how do you score it when somebody who's not attacking or blocking runs into the net? How would that be scored in the stat programs?
Yeah, again, I think it has to do with what type of action they're doing when they contact the net. So, I think as Diane said, if it's on the swing or it's right after the swing on an attack, it would be an attack error. If it's someone going up for a block, trying to go in for a block, that would be a block error. But let's say it's a setter trying to get the ball up, just isn't able to avoid the net. So that would be in that case, because the setter's making an attempt to set the ball, that would be a set error. But it's not necessary. A lot of these officials' actions aren't. They don't all necessarily mean it's always this. It depends on what type of action is being taken when the error is made.
Awesome. Hey, Shane, you did a great job showing all the numbers. Can you do an example of what 21 would look like?
Sure. Yeah. So 21, I'd put 2 on my right hand and 1 over there should be 21. You will see some officials who might stagger. They might go like this to make it clear indication that it's 21, but by rule, it's that way. Yep.
Awesome. And then, when things are going great in volleyball, things are going great, but they can go sideways pretty quickly. So can the group kind of talk about the troubleshooting that goes on when unusual, crazy play or something happens and you have to catch up? Kind of how do you go about doing that? Mindy, can we kind of lead off with you?
Sure, definitely. So kind of what we've all said, just, give yourself some grace. You're not going to get everything that's going to occur as much as we want to get all the stats. It's just too quick to process and then communicate that information to the person who's inputting and have them process it. And you're already like 3 actions behind. So get as much as you can, as we keep saying, have scrap paper around, especially if like the computer freezes or decides to do updates in the middle of something. Just have, just write your caller, keep calling, find your, best finding Nemo and just keep calling. If something needs to be edited, either, flag it, make a note of the, the line. And if you know specifically which action needs to be addressed, definitely note that. Give positive feedback to your crew when you get through a long rally or wacky point. I'm fortunate that as a caller, my inputters will give me a fist bump. So I appreciate that from them. And as we discussed earlier, if it's possible to have like your web stream up, just, as a point of reference for if, there's a wacky rally and then a timeout, you could then review things. And then, just if things are going sideways and like the match is over, but you need to resolve something in a different set, just let the visiting team communications folks know, hey, we're working on something, it might take some time, please bear with us. So just give that heads up. And as I kind of referenced earlier, when it is going wacky, just pick a point for everyone to get on the same page. So as I said, like, start with set on the left side so everyone can catch their breath. and carry on from there, and then just try to move forward.
Awesome, thanks. And you touched a little bit about live stream, and I know we touched about it just a little bit at the start. Can kind of people talk about how they use a live stream as they're statting through a match?
Yeah, so the one situation at USC where there is a second laptop that has what used to be Twitter Media Studio, but it had that ability to just scroll back and forth in the stream is extremely helpful. I don't have that access everywhere that I go, but at Long Beach State, all of their matches are on ESPN Plus, so I'll pull up the live stream there. That one does allow me to pause and rewind if I need to. It runs somewhere around a 20-second delay, so it's a point or two behind usually. So sometimes we luck out and are able to watch it just straight through and kind of verify something. Other times it's like, okay, we've got to go back to, we'll write down the point number. And then again, whether it's on a timeout when you have more time to evaluate it, whether it's looking for one touch or, there's a few times that between sets, I just say we need to rewatch the rally at 15-11, and I'll find where I'm off. Usually I'm missing one or two touches, but that threw the whole point off. But yeah, having the ability to know exactly what it is you're looking for, where it is you're looking for, having that replay is, if you are streaming and have that ability to access the stream on a second machine that's off to the side just for another look at something, it usually doesn't take too long to make those adjustments, but it's extremely helpful to get a lot closer to that 100% than we would be otherwise.
Awesome. Then, Mindy, you're at a smaller school. How do you use live stream replay in your work?
This actually materialized Saturday during our tri-match, where my caller she got a little ahead of the action and then got lost in how the play ended. So I'm like, all right, I'll pull up the webcast, we'll check it out. And it was like, okay, there was a block by the opposing team. This is who was in the block. This is who had the attack. And that's how we, resolve the point. So it's kind of in that case, it's a function of camera angle and uniforms and things like that. So, but it was one of the few times where I've gone to that since we were, fortunately staffed for that to happen. But sometimes it's just a clarification of how the play ended, or if, just figuring out what might have transpired.
Great. And I'll kind of piggyback on that too. I always have my phone up with our live stream, and it doubles. So I know when the live stream's down, if it goes down, and then I can also use it to identify if I miss something quickly. So great tool to have. And a lot of people do have at least a rudimentary live stream.
I think also if you have in our case, if the opposing SID is traveling, they may be able to point out an error or help you with something as well. Or, even with watching between the live stats and a live stream, if they're not traveling, maybe they can say, no, that should have been a kill to number, or whoever it is. So, you can rely on your opposing SID as well.
Yeah, and that's great because they're always going to know their team better than you will. So great resource. And, even if they're not there, reach out to them real quick with a question and you might be able to answer. And then, Diane, I'm going to push it back to you. Kind of what do you do in that post-match? The match just ended. How are you wrapping things up? How are you concluding that match?
Since we use Genius, that I make sure the stats people, print out once the match is final, they print out a final stats for the coaches. And this would be even before they correct any flags or anything like that, just so that the coaches have at least some idea of what the final stats are going to be. Then I have them go back, okay, make any corrections, fix any flags. And we talked about this, is that in most cases that if you can't figure out what the flag is for, it's probably going to be a substitution. So you probably might have missed a substitution, and that's why a play is flagged. Then once everything is printed out, all your things are fixed, so you can finalize your match. Then it automatically goes to the NLS site, so your opposing players can, download the XML, they can download the game book. One thing that I've discovered is that my coaches really like the entire game book because of the additional reports that it prints out. So if your coaches might want to see what an entire game book looks like, if you guys don't normally print out the game book for them. So, check with your coaches, see, hey, this game book prints out all these additional parts. Are you interested in these? And they might say yes. And it's a simple, print a couple extra 2 pages on that. And other than that, it's pretty much you're all done. And with Genius, it's great because you don't have to send anything to your opposing teams. Stat Crew, you're still gonna have to send like an XML to your opponent. I've never worked with Presto, so I don't know what happens there.
Great. And then, Joe, it sounds like there's a scenario you're going to answer here about bad reception digs.
Yeah, so the description, the key point of that one talks about the setter attempting to set the ball straight up. The ball's touched down by a blocker that's also up at the net. And the question is asking, do we credit a block if the setter is available to attack, or a kill? I would go kill in that scenario because the setter has the ability to set, is attempting to set. And if the ball is legally touched on the other side of the net, if they can get to it and they put it down, I would go kill on that one. To me, there's no, that would affect your team attack percentage. If you charged your setter with an attack, it would charge the setter's attack percentage on a ball that they were not attempting to attack. It's just a quality play on the other side of the net by someone who gets to the ball in a legal attacking position and puts it down. So I would go kill in that scenario.
Just a reminder that the ball has to cross the plane of the net in order for it to be eligible. So, and maybe that's something Shane wants to talk about, like what the official might call if the ball has not crossed the plane of the net, or if it has.
So that is a very good point. If the ball does not enter the plane of the net, so it means it can't legally be touched by the player on the opposing side, you will get a reaching over call, which looks like this. And in that instance, you can make a determination. I would probably go with an attack error on the person who is getting the reaching over on it, because in order to give a blocking error on that, you would have to have an attack from the other side. And you didn't have an attack from the other side. You just had somebody trying to play the ball up on their own side, and someone else got a little over anxious and went over the net. So in that instance, I would give that an attacking error on the side who's called for reaching over.
Awesome. That's great. Another question that came through, we kind of touched about some of the advanced analytics you can get from Genius. But does anybody have coaches that kind of use a lot of volleyball metrics, or they use Huddle to break down film? And do they ever compare stats, and how do you approach that if there's maybe some discrepancies on what they're seeing versus what you've statted in game?
Our coaches have one of our assistant coaches on the bench doing volleyball metrics for all matches. They've never asked me to compare a stat, but also the comparisons are different. Like for us, a blocking error is only when somebody is in the net. To them, a blocking error is going to be somebody if the block goes out of bounds. So the stats are different. We have used their stats for, like, if we're looking for something for a spring match, and there's nobody there to stat, we actually will use their stats for a spring match. But I know for most teams, they probably don't do anything with spring, but we do. So, but they've never criticized our stats compared to their stats just because of the differences.
Great. And then Shane, do you kind of want to talk to everybody about the first touch after a block touch, and if that becomes a kill, kind of how that gets inputted?
Yeah, so we were kind of discussing online in the Q&A about block touches, and then what happens after a block touch, and can that be considered a dig, or if a kill directly relates to it. So I'll give you a few scenarios that were pointed out in here. So the first one was if immediately after a block touch, the next action is an attack and a kill, does the person who had the block touch get credit for a dig? And the answer is no in that regard, because the block touch in and of itself is not considered the first contact, because block touches aren't considered contacts. So in order for it to be a dig, it would have to be the first contact after an attack. it's not technically a first contact, so it only goes as an attack and a kill potentially for the attacker in that scenario. Now, if you have the situation where I was just looking at here, and it says if the first touch after the block touch is attacked and you put that touch into NLS, it records it as a dig. And then if you give the team a point, it's going to ask change dig to a kill, I believe. So do you put yes and then delete the dig? Yes, that's what you would need to do on that one in particular, because it's the block touch that you're putting in as the first contact. The best way to do that live, if you can, and if you can remember it, is when you're on that attacking side, do a skip set and then the number of the attacker who did it, and then you won't get prompted about a dig at all. You may get prompted for an assist, but you can just say no in that regard and just go directly to the attacker. But the only time that you will have, and I think this is a fair statement, the only time you're going to have a dig and a kill by the same person back to back is if it is an overpass where, you know, the player first ball over, sends it over, and then it just falls to the ground on the other side because nobody plays it. In that regard, you have to give a dig unless it's serve receive. You'll have to give a dig if it's off an attack, and then you'll have to give a kill to that player because it resulted in a point.
That's awesome. And then, you know, one question that did come through, I think would be great to answer that for the group, is if somebody serves the ball and the other team receives it, it's a weak hit on the reception, and then there's a weak set that they're kind of diving to get it, and then there's a third hit and it doesn't go over. How are you scoring that?
Yeah, so based on that description, I would probably go with an ace. If the setter's on a full sprint just to try to keep the ball alive rather than trying to set up a teammate, and even though they make contact with it, but it's still another uncontrollable set that somebody else is attempting to get to and can't even just get it over the net on the other side. Yes, I know there's 3 touches there, but the fact that neither the second nor the third touch were really able to be controlled or played properly, I would go back to the first one being a bad dig or a bad pass, and credit either the ace or the kill in that situation.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. One final question. Shane, you have a fan club. They'd like to see you do like a 30 or a 32 just for entertainment purposes.
Oh, okay. So here's your 30 and here's your 32.
Awesome.
Or 33 if you want to. 33 right there.
Well, thanks, Shane. That's awesome. Thanks to all our panelists. This is super informative, and thanks for the audience for participating. Big thanks to our presenters today in the discussion and insights on this Teachable Tuesday. Again, this webinar will be on demand later today, so share that with your colleagues, your other statters, your inputters, whatever. Some great knowledge on this today. We encourage you to check our website, collegesportcommunicators.com, for updated information on what's on tap for CSE programming and continuing education. Later this month, we're offering a session on using social media data and analytics, with more webinars to come in November. So stay tuned on those dates and topics that will be announced later. And thanks again for being with us today.